Thank you, Matt. Does this building see any inconsistency between sending a sternly worded letter with a 30-day lead time about humanitarian conditions in Gaza to the Israelis while near simultaneously deploying an advanced anti-missile system with 100 U.S. troops to man it?
No, of course not. We have
What's the
always
message being sent there?
made clear that we are committed to the defense of Israel, and that's why you saw the president make the decision that he made, which I will let my colleagues at the Pentagon speak to in detail. But we've also made clear that there are provisions of U.S. law that we follow. And we will always follow those provisions, and part of that is expecting that the Israeli government fully comply with the requirements under international humanitarian law to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets into Gaza.
Sure. I mean, and this is retreading territory that Humaira and Matt just raised with you, but I mean, 6 months ago, there were suspicions that humanitarian law was not being followed by Israeli forces. So why 6 months on, if the situation is similarly deplorable, do you suspect that situation is meaningfully changed?
So you're right, it is a bit of a retread, and I hope you will accept
fine.
my apology for giving the same answer,
No,
the same
that's
question.
fine. We don't have to retread.
I think it is important to be clear that it is because we saw the situation change. I think the premise of the question, the premise of Humaira's question, is that the situation has been static all along. It hasn't been static. When we intervened back in April to make clear that the level of humanitarian assistance getting in wasn't sufficient, we saw it increase. And we saw that increase sustained for a period of time, but then not long enough, and it came back down. And so we're going to respond to events as they happen. And when humanitarian assistance increases and is an acceptable level, you won't see us raising those concerns. But when we see the situation on the ground that we've seen over the past few months, when we see the level of humanitarian assistance in September, the lowest it has been in any month since the war began, it's appropriate for us to intervene in this way.
And to briefly address the flip side, I mean, the Israeli argument is that allowing this aid in provides fuel for Hamas. They run a protection racket, they get money, they get funds, essentially they think that taking this step is effectively choking off Hamas. Does the U.S. dispute that is a reason why the Israelis are limiting this aid?
So there are, without a doubt, security concerns inside Gaza that make it difficult to deliver aid, that has led to the looting of humanitarian assistance in some cases. But the answer to that is not to stop the flow of food and water that civilians depend on, and that little babies and children need to survive. That cannot be the answer to that problem. The ultimate answer to that problem is to establish a governing authority in Gaza that can provide safety and security for the Palestinian people of Gaza, that can provide safety and security for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, that can provide a long-term political path forward, as we have been making clear for some time. The answer absolutely cannot in any way be penalizing the innocent civilians who depend on this food, water, medicine to live.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize time. I have two more. One is, does the U.S. feel that it has clarity, you don't have to specify what it is, on the timing and the targets that Israel intends to strike in its retaliatory strike on Iran? Does the U.S. feel that it has clarity on the timing and targets that the Israelis intend?
We have had a number of conversations with them about that. Those conversations are ongoing, and I'm going to stick with the policy I set out last week, which is I'm not going to speak to those conversations publicly.
Okay, and just one bigger picture question for clarity. Is it the U.S.'s stance right now that it is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but not calling for one in northern Israel and southern Lebanon?
We continue, so a few things. No, we do continue to want a ceasefire in Gaza, but to be clear what that is, it's not a unilateral ceasefire. We have called for a ceasefire agreement that includes the release of hostages. I think you know what the details of that. And when it comes to Lebanon, ultimately we want a diplomatic solution, and that policy hasn't changed.
But there's no sort of active call for a ceasefire in the same way that there is in Gaza, accompanied by a hostage deal. Is that because the U.S. sees that there is a legitimate and achievable military objective on the part of Israel in northern Lebanon in a way that does not exist in Gaza?
So we believe that Israel has a right to attack and degrade the Hizballah battalions that continue to be just over the border from northern Israel. But ultimately, we want to see a diplomatic solution. I would say that the two situations are incredibly different when it comes to Lebanon. There's United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that we want to see fully implemented. That resolution has requirements for Hezbollah that they have not fulfilled. So it is appropriate for Israel to conduct military operations to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities. So maybe they will pull back beyond the Litani River and finally agree to the provisions of 1701 that they have blown through for 18 years now. And that doesn't change what we want to see in Gaza, which is ultimately a ceasefire agreement. But it's a ceasefire agreement that has burdens on Hamas as well, not just on Israel.